Hello, everyone. My name is Jamille Pinheiro. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Hub at the University of London's School of Advanced Study. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's event, which is part of our Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series. Before we begin, I want to extend my huge thanks to Andreas for accepting our invitation. I would also like to thank Kasia and Mika from Queen Mary, University of London, for collaborating with me to make this event possible, and Kathy Collins for her support. And of course, many thanks to all of you for joining us today. This series is dedicated to fostering interdisciplinary and transnational conversations in the field of the environmental humanities. And today's session will explore the intersections of fossil capitalism, climate justice, and critical theories of the future. Andreas will discuss the implications of fossil capitalization for economic inequality, carbon waste, accumulation, and conceptions of the future. So I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will have time for questions at the end. And if you would like to ask a question, please do so in the chat box. I will now hand it over to Kasia, who will continue by introducing Andreas. And as I said, I look forward to the discussion ahead. Over to you, Kasia.
Thank you so much, Jamille. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone who's joined us here. Thank you, Andreas, once again. It's my pleasure to introduce Andreas Volkers, who's currently the Distinguished Fellow at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies in Erfurt. He studied philosophy and social sciences at the Goethe University in Frankfurt and also at the New School for Social Research in New York. As a traveling academic, his bio spans many places, many fellowships, including London School of Economic, Erfurt, also Advanced Study Institute in Princeton. Importantly, in 2023, he received a research award of the Justus Liebig University in Gießen for his project on fossil modernity. And it is through this term, fossil modernity, that I have encountered Andreas's work. I've read one of his papers, and from that reached out to the person himself. And I'm super grateful that you extended this conversation to our discussion today. And I'm really looking forward to your talk. Over to you, Andreas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your very kind introduction. I don't know, do you already see the slides?
I think you still have to share them.
I have to share them
yes.
again. Okay, I will do that. Okay.
Perfect.
Now, see them? Okay, great. Yeah, first of all, thanks for this invitation. I'm really happy to speak in this great series, and the very kind introduction. What I present today is as Kasia mentioned this, it's part of a book project on fossil modernity, which I'm about to finish, and it's also and this particular idea of future theft is also the topic of a paper for Sericulture and Society that will soon be published or soon be online. So if you're folding laundry right now and find anything of this interesting, there are opportunities to read about this in the nearer or farther future. So with that, I just start. How do we know about the atmospheric's past? A recent article in the Proceedings of the Natural Academy of the Sciences made an intriguing proposition. It used paintings of Turner's and Monet's to provide, quote, proxy evidence for historical trends in atmospheric pollution before instrumental measurements of air pollution became available. And they also make an art historical claim and characterize the style of these paintings as, quote, polluted realism. Interestingly, decades earlier, Michel Serres made a similar observation, quote, no, Turner is not a pre-impressionist, he is a realist, or more precisely, a materialist. He shows the matter of 1844. Looking at Turner's Rain, Speed and Light, first exhibited in London in 1844, seen here, it becomes obvious what Serres means. The train steaming over the bridge not only indicates a new social-technical environment, but becomes with a new atmospheric and indeed optical environment. The painting expresses its historical materialism in the sense that matter itself is historical, the matter of 1844. There's another historical materialist who gave testimony to the matter of 1844, namely Friedrich Engels in his Conditions of the English Working Class, published in 1845. Turner's and Engels' materialism may seem worlds apart. It is striking, however, that Engels described England's industrial cities not only as a scene for the antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat. The city is also the scene for an antagonism between fossil fires and laboring lungs. Quote Engels, in London, 2.5 million pairs of lungs and 250,000 coal fires are concentrated in an area of 3 to 4 geographical square miles. The lungs of the inhabitants do not take in sufficient oxygen, and this leads to mental torpor and low physical vitality. Similar to Engels' economic critique, Engels' proto-ecological critique stresses that the air is not the same for all lungs. It is worse in the workers' district, typically located in the east, because the wind usually comes from the west in Europe. And this inequality is even more so for the miners who have to work in what Engels calls an atmosphere of the mine, which is, of course, particularly toxic and creates the black lung disease seen on the right. So interestingly, there is already in Engels a form of what Stephanie Barker called working class environmentalism, at least avant la lettre. However, attention towards these phenomena remained sporadic in 19th century historical materialism. The Communist Manifesto, published 3 years later together with Marx, exclaims, workers of all countries unite and not breathers of the world conspire. I wish that this pun was from me, but it's actually from Timothy Choi. I think it is fair to say that historical materialism and the political movement it inspired was preoccupied with economic, not with ecological matters. It focuses on exploitation, not on exposure, on production, not on pollution, on work, not on waste. In addition, Engels' atmospheric problematic is not that of climate change. Engels focused on relatively local health effects that would affect workers within a single lifetime. In the case of the mine, there's also a straightforward class relation between miner and mine owner, both in economic and in biopolitical terms. Yet climate change is planetary, affects multiple generations, and it creates class relations across long temporal and spatial distances. In what follows, I will thus take an updated approach to account for the matter of 2025, and this would yield sort of a new historical materialism, or if you want, a polluted historical materialism. And this, for me, warrants 2 shifts. First, I will focus on the vicious entanglement of capital and fossil matter. I will argue that this matter is not just that matter is not just, as for the historical materialist, just a passive raw material for production, but an unruly ecological mediator. bringing a Marxist and a Latourian understanding of mediation together. I will thus argue that social relations in capitalism are at least doubly mediated, both by economic forms as well as the material content and especially the spillover of these forms. This brings me to my second deviation from Marx. When it comes to economic forms, Marxists usually look at the commodity. In contrast, informed by valuation studies, I will focus here on the asset form. So I will look at objects of financial investment rather than on market circulation. This allows me to grasp the peculiar temporal mediation that underpins fossil capital. With and beyond the valuation studies, I want to show how turning fossil fuels into capital entails a calculative devaluation and a material dispossession of the future, or what I call future theft. I will do this by first showing how fossil fuels become assets in a process of fossil capitalization. I will then show how why this implies future theft, which I understand as a temporally inverted form of what Marx called original accumulation. And I will finally draw some conclusions of what this understanding means for thinking history, futurity, and temporality. So let me start with the distinction between asset and commodity. A fossil commodity is, for example, the gasoline sold in a gas station. A fossil asset is, for example, an extraction project. While assets can, in principle, also be bought and sold, their key economic function is to generate revenues for investors. Assets are capitalized property, so something you invest in to receive some kind of rent, some kind of cash flow. A house that you own and live in would be a property. A house you sell is a commodity. A house that you rent out is an asset. And if you don't own a house, you will probably be the one to pay the rent for the investor. To decide which oil and gas fields, this also shapes the way assets are valuated and calculated. And because the asset value is basically the sum of future monetary returns, the sum of the rents you can expect. And this is important for the fossil fuel industry because investors and oil and gas companies want to know how much worth an asset is to decide whether they invest in it or not. So to decide which oil and gas fields, for example, are worth investing in, investors calculate how much revenue it will yield over its economic lifetime. Because, and the standard calculative format to do so is some form of net present value calculation. Again, the basic assumption here is that the present value of an asset is the sum of future monetary returns it generates. So the present value of an asset derives from the future. In the fossil fuel industry, the selling of coal, oil, and gas generates revenue, of course. So the geological prospection of the subsurface, together with the economic prospection of future market prices, determines present value. It's just a multiplying future price with existing or expected oil reserves. Yet the present value of assets depends on a further factor, the so-called discount rate. Expected returns are discounted according to a previously determined rate. There are many explanations or legitimizations for discounting. Investors have risks. They have to exercise restraint and not spending all their money in the present. But interestingly, when you just focus on the effects, it becomes very clear what this does. It cheapens the future. It makes an asset much cheaper in the present than it promises to be along its lifetime. With a 5% discount rate, a cash flow of 100 euro in a year from now is only worth 95 euros in the present. And this goes, and this discount rate is applied every year, so the future becomes cheaper the farther it is away. The discount rate in many ways underpins the actual profits of investors. So basically the difference between the present investment and future revenues. Tim Mitchell has therefore argued that discounting allows to, quote, extract revenue from the future, end of quote. So capitalization distributes value temporally from the future to the present. Eco-Marxist Jason Moore has argued that fossil fuels are cheap energy because their extraction appropriates cheap nature, but that when the value of fossil assets does not so much derive from past biospheric work, but actually from future expectations, fossil energy is not only premised on cheap nature, but also on cheap future, and so on discounting. As Liliana Doganova observes, the discount rate is simply an inverse interest rate. However, both investments as well as debt place what Tim Mitchell calls a burden of repayment on the future. For example, tenants must repay real estate investors' revenue expectations with high rents. So there's a difference between landlords just wanting to recoup their costs and make some extra earnings or seeking a high rate of return on their investment. In the fossil fuel industry, this repayment burden initially falls on extractive workers and energy consumers. So to meet revenue expectations, wages must comply with estimated production costs, and prices need to remain as high as possible. However, fossil assets come with an economic and ecological surcharge. The carbon waste they produce demands payback in the form of biospheric work of carbon sequestration and also adaptation work. And the ecological destruction global heating causes is already responsible for enormous waves of dispossession, ranging from damaged homes to the disappearance of whole islands, coastal regions, and arable land. So the future revenues fossil assets generate for investors rely on the burdens of those affected by climate damages. And this is a highly unequal relation. A recent study by Lucas Chancel showed that the richest 1% emit as much as the poorest 50% of the world's population. Remarkably, the driving force behind this is the same that also explains rising economic inequality. So famously, Thomas Piketty showed that economic inequality today stems much more from differences in capital ownership than from differences in wages. And in a similar vein, Chancel, who is a longtime collaborator of Piketty, showed how this plays out for emissions inequality by showing that, quote, the bulk, so 70% of emissions from the global top 1% comes from their investments rather than from their consumption. It is, in other words, not so much how the 1% spends their money on private yachts, as we see on the right, but how they make their money, as fossil investors. It's fossil capital and not just carbon consumption that's the driving force here. At the same time, the global poor are much more exposed to climate damages. Chancel estimates that climate change will lead to a 75% relative income loss among the poorest 50%, but only to 3% loss among the richest 10%. So the relation between fossil asset owners and climate victims is, in fact, an intertemporal relation, the one sucking revenue from the future and the other being dispossessed in the future. But it's not simply an intergenerational relation, as climate inequality is often framed as. Rather, it is an intertemporal class relation, and in racial capitalism, this of course very much includes race, but also gender, north and south as key factors that determine socioeconomic position in capitalism. So in many ways, all that which fossil capitalization discounted to secure present values is bound to return as ecological debt with compound interest in the future. So you can think of climate change in this way as a tax on the future, but in fact, a regressive tax. The capital generated by fossil investors will make them and their children richer in the future. So they can easily cope with 3% income loss because the rate of return of their capital amounts to 7 to 9% each year. They make a net benefit from climate change because they are much better off this way than in an alternative scenario in which their current assets strand due to stricter climate regulation. An income loss of 73% among the poorest 50 amounts to complete dispossession among large parts of the world population. Fossil capitalization thus not only devalues the future, but dispossesses large parts of future generations. Fossil capitalization is future theft. From this perspective, fossil capitalization relies on a temporally inverted form of what Marx called original accumulation. As you might know, Marx argued that capitalism is based on a violent process of expropriation that created the conditions for capitalist exploitation, so the separation of workers from the means of production. A series of thinkers, starting with Rosa Luxemburg, have extended Marx's concept by emphasizing that primitive accumulation is not a single founding act, but rather capitalism constantly repeats its violent origin, constantly expropriates. This certainly characterizes fossil capitalization. So this interpretation, fossil projects are associated with massive forms of dispossession from indigenous lands on which pipelines are built to German villages that must give way to ignite mining. However, the specificity of fossil capitalization as future theft requires a further twist in series of original accumulation. In the temporal dimension, the specificity of future theft is that dispossession follows rather than precedes accumulation. The present value of fossil assets is premised on future climate dispossession. So fossil accumulation postpones dispossession, delays it into the future. Marx regarded the expropriation of primitive accumulation as prehistory of capitalism. The destructive effects of climate change is much more like the afterlife of fossil capitalization. But nevertheless, future expropriation is no less constitutive of capitalism than past expropriation. After all, assets or asset values are born out of the future. And this is not all. For Marx, the original accumulation was also a site of violence. While the workings of capital in itself are, according to Marx, formally peaceful, the birth story of capital was written in letters of blood and fire, as he said. Longer quote of Marx: these methods relied in part on the most brutal violence, for example, the colonial system did, but they all employed the power of the state to quicken the transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, as though in a hothouse, Treibhausmäßig in German. Violence is, in fact, a kind of economic power. And again, in German, this is ökonomische Potenz, which brings out this constitutive and not just coercive force of violence in capital. Fossil capitalization, however, replaces the main agent of violence. It does not so much resort to the proverbial greenhouse state, but becomes effective through literal greenhouse gases. It delegates the expropriative violence to an apparently natural agent, so fossil CO2 emissions that exert an atmospheric violence of global heating. And this is, of course, not immediate violence, as in the state, but environmentally mediated. It is, of course, an open question what social dynamics will be unleashed by this constitutive power. However, we can already witness processes that seem to repeat the patterns of primitive accumulation at the dawn of capitalism in Britain. For example, Kasia Paprocki has shown that global development organizations are advising rice farmers in Bangladesh threatened by sea level rise to switch from agriculture to aquaculture, so to harvest shrimp instead of rice. And this feels awfully similar to the transformation of arable land into sheep pastures before the Industrial Revolution in Britain. In both instances, it involves a shift from grain cultivation for domestic markets or subsistence production to animal raising for export markets. And the violence of climate change is also constitutive in creating new forms of capital. Most of what we now call natural capital is mostly valued economically as carbon sink. And so this value in many ways stems from the polluting effects of fossil capitalization. So fossil residuals like CO2 emissions turn nature into capital. And this often means that people who live not only of but with this nature become dispossessed. Of course, it does not have to be this way. However, to think about alternatives also demands to reorient critical approaches towards futurity and historicity. And this is the final part which I want to close. Marx hoped that the revolution could reverse the original accumulation. It reappropriates what has been stolen. So for him, the revolution is, quote, the expropriation of the expropriators. Understood according to the dialectical figure of negation, however, this reappropriation was not simply restitutive. The revolution would also seize the wealth made possible by original accumulation. Marx understood this as progress, even though it implies an enormous generational sacrifice on part of those exploited and expropriated in the past. So Marx's progress is never linear, of course, it is dialectical, meaning that the work of the negative provokes progress. Today, of course, the wind has changed, not only because socialist revolution is nowhere on the horizon. Since economic progress goes along with ecological degradation, the generational sacrifice does not only fall on the past, but also on the future. If the value of fossil capital is not simply based on past work, but on economic and ecological burdens it imposes on the future, the revolution cannot appropriate material wealth without the waste that goes along with it. Capitalism may or may not be haunted by the specter of a possible future capitalism today, but it is already clear that every imaginable socialism will surely be haunted by the material specter of past capitalism. Any eco-socialist action, therefore, cannot simply be reappropriative, it must also be reparative. If you don't want to buy into progress and revolution and dialectical history and etc., you can also understand Marx genealogically. In this understanding, the original accumulation story simply exposes that the seemingly peaceful order of capital and property relations is premised on expropriative violence, similar to the way Nietzsche argued that our moral order has a violent origin. But what happens to this argument once we recognize that the value of fossil capitalism hinges on dispossession and violence in the future? To critically account for the inverted original accumulation requires to also invert genealogical critique. This kind of critique has to unsettle the present not only by recalling past violence, but by invoking the violent future. However, this cannot mean, as it did for genealogy in the wake of Foucault, to disclose the future simply as an open horizon. In fact, Foucault and much of the neo-Nietzschean left in the second half of the 20th century suspended belief in progress. They did, however, retain the idea of the future as an open horizon or a space of contingency. The future became sort of the never-ending empty page in the book of history. And what genealogy should do was to show how that which is came to be and how it could become otherwise. So modern critique assumed progress, postmodern critique suspends progress. However, it retains the idea of a disposable future from the modern historical imaginary. Today, this stance has become problematic. The future is no longer a storehouse of possibilities, but became a repository of liabilities. The future is no longer simply a resource for the realization of the dreams and hopes of the present. It is already occupied with the residuals of fossil modernity like CO2 that shape the trajectory of future ecologies forever. Yes, I would even say that imagining the future as empty territory runs the risk of repeating the future invoked by capital that similarly assumes the future to be open, if only open for business, of course. Rather, I believe that we have to understand that the future is a densely populated territory. More and more future territories are already claimed by capital at the expense of those being or becoming dispossessed by global heating. This would imply that we have to give up political ontologies of contingency, so a political imaginary where we take the future as contingent and uncertain for granted. Rather, we need a historical ontology of the future. Such a historical ontology would have to take into account that the very material grammar of temporality has changed. Just as the matter of 1844 is different from the matter of 1612, the future today is different from the future of 1844. Precisely because economic and ecological matters today are different. We now have 420 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere, and this sets the future thermostat. So remember, the breath you take to anchor yourself in the present moment is always already thick with history. To reclaim the future against the claims of capital and carbon, we must listen to the claims it makes on us, but how to do this? This is my last question, and this is a bit rough, but it comes out of something I discussed with Kasia before the talk. There's a certain undercurrent of critical theories that have never subscribed to modernity's future orientation. Instead, they have mobilized seemingly backward-looking motives. I'm thinking of the notion of Eingedenken or remembrance in Benjamin and Adorno, mourning in Butler's queer theory, or wake work in Christina Sharp. Their thinking is structured by events that were so traumatic that they did not allow to simply move forward. The Holocaust, slavery, the AIDS crisis. For them, the past is not finished. It creates a past dependence that locks in certain futures, and the suffering of the past shall and cannot be forgotten. For Benjamin, the idea of progress was not only discredited because it distracts from the fact that history is lurching from disaster to disaster, it also does injustice to the oppressed of the past who have repeatedly falling victims to the wheels of progress. So Benjamin is not willing to pay the price of progress dialectical history would entail. He wanted no generational sacrifice, also not for the past. Benjamin therefore maintained that revolutionary action should not so much feed on the ideal of liberated grandchildren, this is a quote, as on the image of the enslaved ancestors. But what happens if the grandchildren will likely share the destiny of their ancestors? So when the miner exposed to the toxic atmosphere of the mine is only a canary for the climate catastrophe to come, can we extend the remembrance and work of mourning and waking to those damaged, dispossessed in the future? What would that look like, and how could this nourish current struggles for, if not a better, then at least a livable future? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. That was fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
You're really grateful. Yes.
I'm sure people have many questions, so feel free to start posting them in the chat, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand, and Jamille will direct the chat. But maybe to kind of break the ice, or maybe see through the fog, to use your opening image, Andreas, I wanted to ask one question, and I feel for maybe because I'm still kind of holding on to some optimism, I don't know, some kind of critical hope. I feel that among all the kind of futurelessness that you are discussing, or even presentlessness, because you are very right to diagnose, of course, deep inequality, that for many, this is not the question of the future, it's the question already of the now, that it's stolen. I think you still invest in a notion of repair. And both in your earlier writing, for which kind of we met, and also today you use the term reparative work, or maybe reparative critique. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to maybe ask you to explain a bit more, or just maybe direct to your other writings. What is that work of repair technically and kind of doing for those communities for whom the present is already gone? Because I could see, you know, for the lack of kind of, let's use the us, I could see that maybe for those communities that's like us here still is a question of the future. But when the present is already gone, what would that reparative work look like? And especially in that context of, you use the terms, you know, state violence moving to environmental violence. Of course, we can hear echoes of Rob Nixon's slow violence. We can hear the echo of Berlin, the notion of slow death. So how to think, is there any way of thinking about a future, even if that future is just tomorrow? It's not a question of 100 years, but just a future which is tomorrow, that isn't death. Because I wonder whether we're not running the risk also of kind of an image of dead end for communities already dispossessed. And if we are, maybe there's a form of violence that we're doing there too. So kind of a couple of interrelated questions. You choose whichever you want to speak to, but thank you once again, a lot to think through, and I look forward to audience's questions to you.
Okay, yeah, so thank you so much for this question. That probably helps to clarify a few things. So first of all, in the paper version of this, I have a longer section of climate reparation. So this would really be the question of payback. Who pays for the damages that will occur in the future and are already occurring in the present? And there are interesting. There are currently law cases that sue fossil fuel companies for damages that are already happening, also across jurisdictions, and it's very interesting. And there are many people who are now starting to think about just forms or solidaric forms of climate insurance. So all these fiscal aspects are, of course, very important. And I would say that personally, I have some kind of hope by paradoxically looking at these immense economic inequalities, because it also shows that it is possible to live within the limits of within climate limits, and and I really think that these inequalities show once again how important it is to address economic inequalities, which now have also become compounded by ecological inequalities. And I think in some ways this really gives me hope, at least in principle, because we're not in the situation where, it's just too big of a population, or humans are just inherently greedy, and these numbers really show how it has to do with capitalism and current social inequalities. At the same time, there are two reactions I get from engaging when I talk about repair and reparative critique. The one is, this is too pessimistic, because it's only, you're already assuming that everything is shit and broken. And the other one is, that's too optimistic, because you think that we can heal and repair and fix everything, and this just gives way to I don't know, cheap ideas of fixing existing problems. I would say that I of course try to navigate between the two, between being too optimistic and too pessimistic. So I would say that we cannot think of, I think repair is necessary and can have, as I pointed out, radical political implications. But secondly, also that we must be aware that that there are some things that cannot be fixed. And I think this is also a reason why something like work of mourning and wake work is so important, to acknowledge this and to keep this reparative spirit alive. Yeah.
May I ask a question as well? So I really liked how you framed the beginning of your presentation, thinking through Turner and Monet's painting and discussing historical materialism in the 19th century through their paintings, and connecting that with your broader argument about historical materialism or matter, and also your observation about this scene of antagonism between fossil fires and laboring lungs that Engels described, right? And yeah, so I was thinking about how this earlier scene of environmental inequality relates to contemporary understandings of climate injustice. Mm-hmm. And as always, I'm interested in discourse, rhetoric, language, right? And I've been following the discourse, the rhetoric, leading up to the next COP, which will happen in Brazil, my home country, in my hometown in Belém, in the Amazon, how they're mobilizing the notion of sustainable mining. So I would be interested in thinking with you, if you would like, about the conceptions of future that inform this idea of sustainability. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about mining specifically, and how so much of our life, even as academics, is driven by batteries, by lithium these days. So computers, mobile phones. So in a way, mining is very present in our present and in any, I think, idea of future that one might conceive. So anyway, would you be interested in thinking about sustainability and conceptions of future with us for a bit? And thank you so much again for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So first, I'm so this first part is actually not from the paper, but it's from a longer chapter about the sort of the genealogy of the discovery of environmental problems associated with fossil fuels in the book. And it's interesting to see that over and over again, you have these patterns that marginalized people are the first to be exposed to these threats. And that one of the problems is really that people did not hear the calls of these canaries in a way, right? That this means that this is precisely the reason why we are now so late, because these early warning calls haven't been heard because of these marginalization and because these lives meant less. And in a way, climate change now very much seems to be this universal problem of all of humanity, but I think it only does so because it's much easier to see, because it's not so local and immediate, these effects. It's harder to see how it still continues these old inequalities in many ways. And so I think that is important to add kind of to the story. And about sustainability, I think it's interesting. So I think someone in the chat wrote that sustainable mining is an oxymoron because it of course depletes finite resources and that cannot be regenerated, etc. And I would very much share this critique of all these notions of where you say, like sustainable growth, etc. Just putting the old modern term for sustainable to make it appear to everyone, right? That is the basic strategy. But I also think that that still sustainability, even if in a stronger version, was always about protecting a future that could in principle be without damage, right? That is not affected by environmental problems and catastrophes. And even historically, it's been very much ingrained in economic projects like German forestry. It's one of the origin stories of this, which is very much about exploiting the forest and not just saving it. It's saving it for exploitation. And but what I wanted to say is especially that I think in many ways this idea of a sustainable future is already gone, and sticking too much to sustainability implies cruel optimism. So Berlin was already invoked, or what I call green wishing. So not greenwashing, but wishing that this green future could be real, and we must and this idea of the future is already burdened is an idea that I want to set against this cruel optimism.
Yes, green wishing. Yeah, that's a very eloquent term. I mean, yeah, the future is already overburdened by the cumulative effects of carbon waste and economic inequality. And I think the expression that you also used, the future as a repository of liability, sums it up very well as well. The future as this terrain that is so densely populated by the consequences of the past. So that's a very eloquent way of putting it. I wanted to ask if others have questions that they would like to share, or Kasia just wanted to make sure people have an opportunity to participate. Yeah. Okay, so if not, I have some questions, but Kasia, would you like to share another one?
If anyone just wants to raise their hand, you can just use you can press reactions in there. You can raise your hand, or just put your name in the chat if you don't know how to use it, and then you can just speak. So I think, well, Andreas, as you know, like my work is rooted in kind of in Caribbean studies. So of course, the notion of reparation and repair, it's a huge debate there, and I'm really glad that some of the discussion we had on Wake by Christina Sharp and others also fit in with your thinking. But I want to also kind of maybe push a little bit from the macroeconomic scale, which I think you're maybe for some of us it was almost like wow, like maybe for some of us here even well versed in Marx still, but to think about the environmental humanity, so the human aspect of those losses and lives and futures lost. So I just wonder where are individual stories, where kind of multiplicity of temporalities, where are people dreams and hope in your macro narrative? Because you mentioned kind of the lungs, the breathers on the world, and this is when you do the micro, right? Then you go back to the human to illustrate a macro point. But staying with that human, or maybe more than human, what is the place of the more kind of individual macro scale and the individual lives in your macro story? Because at times it seems to me this is very much like a macro narrative, because you're rewriting, you're arguing for new historical materials, and it should stay maybe at that level. But again and again, kind of we go back. So I just wanted to maybe ask you about the question of method that guide your maybe bigger book project, if you want to talk about it, because you said you're kind of almost finished, and just the space of the human, the modern human, in all these grand equations of asset liabilities and climate agreements.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, I should say that it's not. I mean, probably it's interesting that you say that it comes off as a macro story, because I of course come from, I don't know, A&T, and I mean I'm also interested. I have this critical theory background, but I also come from A&T and STS, so I'm very much against this separation of these different micro, meso, macro thinking in a way. But maybe my old critical theory self comes through here. I tend to admit, but I want to say just that of course it's focusing on these calculations, probably not so much with the statistics, but focusing on these calculations is a way to emphasize that all of this what happens is embedded in micro practices that do these calculation, capitalization, valuations, etc. But I would also say, and this is partly something that relates to my answer to Jamille before that precisely because climate change is often it is so hard to show the effects of climate change in at a micro scale, because it actually is a macro phenomenon. It's even more than macro social. It's planetary, because it's mediated through the atmosphere. That I think it is important to also stress these points. And I understand that the problem with this is that in a way you buy into the kind of abstractions that also economists deal with, in only speaking about costs and then these who gains what and percentage numbers, etc. And you kind of lose the embodied experience. That is why in the paper, I put in this court case between a Peruvian farmer who sues a German energy company for compensations to make this more palatable. But and also this integration of the lungs is, I think, important, because this shows where these what economists call externalities are really what really is the externality and where it is and how it looks. But I agree that it's hard to make it all in this one talk. But thank you for asking this.
Yes, there's a question from Natasha in the chat. Natasha is asking, what is the work needed to keep reparative spirits alive? It's a good question. I mean, in terms of not, going beyond the binary despair, action, or dystopia, utopia. What is the way forward?
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. Benjamin said we have to organize pessimism, and I think that even having a bleak outlook on the future and even mourning and waking for what is lost can give you the strength to combat what is going on and to keep fighting for reparations. I think Wendy Brown makes this distinction between reparation as something that is repaired and reparative as an ethos that keeps pushing for further reparative action. And I think it's in confronting the partly impossibility of repairing everything or fixing something with reparations, losses that are just have already happened, is important to keep this spirit alive. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And Jacob has a question as well. Are you okay with being recorded, Jacob?
Fine. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. And this is a little bit of maybe a return to what you were getting towards in your previous answer. I liked very much the framework or the explanation that you gave in terms of, or vignette maybe, of modern critique being about a progressive future, the postmodern critique being about a contingent future, and the fossil modern critique being about an occupied future. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the contingencies on which that occupied future rests. So in your sort of understanding or in your works, what are the assemblages that are contributing to that occupied future, but also what possible assemblages are made through that occupied future, so that we maybe don't end up in the dead end of the future. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, so part of this, and I elaborate more on this in the paper version, is that the way that capital claims the future as its kind of territory, to make this spatial analogy. And this is through these calculations, but also very heavily through law. For example, just in general, property law is, and I think the first one in the tradition was Bentham to say that is about granting a right to this kind of property, an enduring right. And the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann would call that time binding. And there's a lot about how in Katharina Pistor's great work about this way of how legal techniques sort of enclose the future or give these assets, guarantee these assets a long time span. And I think this is very important for me to say, no, the future is not just contingent because there is, or it's because it's already claimed so much by capital. But still, it's of course right to say and to emphasize that these laws could also be changed. They are not inevitable. But then there's sort of the liability side of the asset, right? The ecological liability side. And this is the thing that is much harder to negotiate or change. And I would say that it is important to take this into account and not to assume that we can simply create the future in these ecological terms from scratch, but that the comportment we have towards the future maybe also has to change in terms of maybe adapting to future climate conditions, etc. Which is, I think, different from the modern attitude towards the future as something that is a blank space that you can plan and mold.
Thank you so much. And sorry, I'm afraid we are running out of time, but there's a question from Emily Malik in the chat. Would you like to read from it, Andreas? Or...
Yeah, I can just look in the chat.
Yes. So yeah, it's a question about the potential to influence systems when capitalism is the water we swim in. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't think I have an easy answer to this.
An easy answer, yeah, Emily.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's a rather.
But thank you for this. Thank you for this.
Yeah, it's the dilemma of being offered funding to do work, but realizing that, well, capitalism is the water that we swim in. But anyway, it's we could discuss this at length, but thank you, Emily, for sharing this, and I can, offer my solidarity. And I would like to thank you for presenting, Andreas. This was amazing, truly very inspiring work, which I will continue to follow. Thank you, Kasia, for all your contributions. Jacob, the others who have contributed questions. The critical conversations in environmental humanities will continue. Please follow our website. We have a Blue Sky account as well. We will keep posting about upcoming events, and the recording of this event will be available as well soon. And thank you so much.